It's strange to think that my two aunts, the women I had looked up to my entire life, could have pulled me into something that would destroy my trust in them forever. If anyone had told me that they were capable of this kind of betrayal, I would have laughed it off. I grew up thinking they were like my second mothers, the women who spoiled me with gifts, gave me advice when I didn't want to hear it, and always had my back. But looking back, I can see the signs. Hindsight is always clearer, isn't it? I'm not sure how to start explaining the mess they dragged me into. I guess it all began when I noticed they started asking me for favors more frequently. Small things at first, nothing alarming. Can you tell Uncle Tim that I was with you last weekend? Just in case he asks if your mom calls, tell her I'm with Aunt Claire. Okay, stuff like that. I didn't think much of it because families do that, right? We cover for each other. It's like an unspoken rule. Little did I know I was stepping into a world of lies and deceit that would spiral out of control. Aunt Claire and Aunt Sarah were inseparable. They were my mom's younger sisters, and while they were close to her, I always felt like they had this special connection with each other. Growing up, I thought they were the coolest people in the world. Claire was married to Uncle Tim, a mild-mannered, quiet man who always seemed content in the background. Sarah, on the other hand, had never settled down. She bounced from relationship to relationship, always claiming she hadn't found the one. For the longest time, I admired their independence, their closeness, and their apparent loyalty to family. Claire was the more maternal one, always fussing over me and trying to give me life advice. Sarah was more carefree, the fun aunt who took me to concerts and gave me books she said would change my life. It was all good, wholesome family love, until it wasn't. The first time they really crossed the line with me was during one of our usual family dinners. We were all sitting around the table, laughing, eating, and reminiscing about old times. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed, and I was enjoying the comfort of being around people I loved. Then, suddenly, in the middle of dessert, Aunt Claire leaned over and whispered something to me. "Hey, can you do me a favor? If Tim asks, tell him I was with you last Tuesday evening." I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. It was an odd request, but nothing that seemed immediately dangerous or wrong. Maybe she had a surprise planned for him or something, I reasoned. "Sure," I said, smiling, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. Aunt Sarah, who was sitting across from me, gave me a knowing look. "You're such a good kid," she said, a smirk playing on her lips. "Always helping us out." I brushed it off as just another quirky thing my family did, but over the next few weeks, the requests became more frequent and far more uncomfortable. Each time they asked me to lie for them, the stories got more complicated. At first, I rationalized it. Aunt Claire probably just needed space from Tim. Maybe Sarah was dating someone she wasn't ready to introduce to the family yet. But I soon realized the truth was far darker than I wanted to believe. One evening, Aunt Sarah called me. She sounded frantic, like she had been crying. "Can you come over? I really need to talk to you." Her voice was shaky, and I could hear the desperation. Without hesitation, I drove over to her house, my heart racing. When I arrived, she was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What's going on?" I asked, sitting down beside her. "I need you to do something for me," she said quietly. "Something important." I didn't like the sound of this. "What is it?" Sarah sighed and looked away. "I've been seeing someone. He's married, and I need you to cover for me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind went blank for a moment, and then everything came rushing back at once. The little lies, the favors, the weird looks between her and Claire. It all clicked. They weren't asking me for harmless favors, they were dragging me into their secret world of infidelity. "You're cheating on someone's husband?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's not that simple," she replied, her voice filled with frustration. "You wouldn't understand." I felt sick to my stomach. "So all those times you asked me to cover for you, you were seeing this guy?" Sarah nodded, avoiding my gaze. "I didn't have a choice. Please, you have to help me." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't the fun, carefree aunt I thought I knew. This was someone entirely different. Someone selfish and manipulative. "I can't do this," I said, standing up. "This isn't right." Sarah's face twisted in anger. Oh, don't get all high and mighty on me now. You've been covering for Claire too. You think she's any better than I am? She's been seeing someone too." My head spun. Aunt Claire too. I couldn't believe it. My whole life I had trusted these women, and now I was finding out they were both betraying their families. I walked out of Aunt Sarah's house that night feeling more lost and confused than ever. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing with questions, but I couldn't talk to anyone about it. How could I? They were family, and family loyalty was everything. At least that's what I had been raised to believe. The next few weeks were a blur. Claire and Sarah continued to ask me for favors, to cover for their lies, and I reluctantly agreed, each time feeling more trapped than the last. I couldn't say no. If I did, I risked destroying the family. But every time I lied for them, I felt a little piece of myself die. One day, after weeks of internal struggle, I did something I never thought I would do. I turned to Reddit. I created an anonymous account and posted my story in one of the relationship advice subreddits. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I needed to vent. I needed someone to tell me what to do. The post blew up overnight. Hundreds of comments flooded in, people telling me how toxic my aunts were, how I needed to stand up for myself, how covering for them was only enabling their behavior. Some users were sympathetic, while others were brutally honest, telling me that family loyalty didn't mean covering up for other people's mistakes. I read every single comment over and over again until the advice started sinking in. They were right. I had been manipulated by my aunts, forced into a situation that wasn't fair. But knowing that didn't make it easier. I still didn't know how to confront them. The turning point came when Aunt Claire's affairs started getting out of hand. The man she was seeing was married, and his wife had started getting suspicious. Claire was freaking out, calling me constantly, begging me to help her cover her tracks. She was terrified the wife had hired a private investigator. That's when I realized how deep I was in this mess. If I didn't get out now, I would be dragged down with them. The private investigator could come after me. I could be implicated in their affairs, and my whole life could be ruined. I had to do something. I decided to confront them. I called a meeting with both Aunt Claire and Aunt Sarah at my house. When they arrived, they seemed nervous, sensing that something was wrong. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm. They exchanged glances, but neither of them spoke. "I know about everything," I continued. "I know you're both cheating, and I know you've been using me to cover for you." Claire's face turned pale, while Sarah crossed her arms defensively. "So what? You've been helping us, haven't you?" she snapped. "I didn't know the full extent of it," I replied, trying to keep my emotions in check. "And I can't do this anymore. I'm done lying for you." Claire looked like she was about to cry. "Please, you don't understand. If Tim finds out, he'll leave me. My whole life will be ruined." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Oh, stop with the dramatics, Claire. We all knew this was going to come out eventually." I couldn't believe how cold she was. "You don't care, do you?" I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You don't care about anyone but yourselves." Sarah shrugged. "I'm just being realistic. People cheat. It's not the end of the world." "For you, maybe," I replied. "But it's not just your lives you're messing with. What about your families? What about me?" Claire sobbed quietly, but Sarah remained stone-faced. "If you're going to turn on us now, fine," she said, her tone icy. "But don't think for a second that we're going down alone. We know things about you too, you know." Her words hung in the air like a threat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew Sarah was manipulative, but I hadn't expected her to turn on me like this. I thought I was family. I thought I mattered to them. I stood my ground. "I don't care. I'm done." With that, I walked out of the room, leaving them sitting there in stunned silence. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I couldn't keep living this lie. I had to come clean, even if it meant blowing up the entire family. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and fear. I dreaded what would happen when the truth came out, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, I wasn't carrying the weight of their lies anymore. I had freed myself, even if it meant facing the consequences. And then it happened. The truth came out. Uncle Tim found out about Claire's affair, and the fallout was immediate. He left her, devastated and heartbroken. Sarah's affair also came to light, and the man's wife filed for divorce. The family was in chaos, and my role in covering for them didn't go unnoticed. There were some tense conversations with my parents, but in the end, they understood why I did what I did. As for Claire and Sarah, our relationship was never the same. They couldn't forgive me for betraying them, and I couldn't forgive them for dragging me into their mess in the first place. I posted a final update on Reddit, thanking everyone for their advice. It wasn't the outcome I had hoped for, but it was the one I needed. I was finally free from their manipulation, and though it hurt, I knew I had done the right thing. In the end, I learned that family isn't always worth sacrificing your morals for. Sometimes, the people closest to you can be the ones who betray you the most, and sometimes, the hardest thing you can do is walk away. Though I had tried to prepare myself for the fallout, I wasn't ready for how deeply it would affect me. The revelation of my aunt's affairs wasn't just a scandal. It was a fracture in the foundation of the only family I had ever known. I felt like a stranger in my own home, in my own skin, as if the last shred of innocence that tethered me to my childhood had been ripped away. Uncle Tim moved out almost immediately after finding out about Aunt Claire. I hadn't been there for the confrontation, but my mom later told me that it had been explosive. Tim, who had always been soft-spoken and kind, had completely broken down, screaming at Claire in a way no one had ever heard before. Years of bottled-up feelings of inadequacy, anger, and betrayal had erupted all at once. He had loved her deeply, and she had destroyed that trust with her selfishness. As for Aunt Sarah, her situation was even messier. The man she had been seeing was no saint, and when his wife found out, she didn't just file for divorce, she came after Sarah with a vengeance. There were nasty rumors flying around about her being a homewrecker, about affairs with other men too, and about her long history of deceptive relationships. It wasn't long before Sarah's entire reputation within the family and in her social circle disintegrated. It was all too much for me to handle at once. The more I learned, the more I realized that these women I had idolized were nothing like the people I thought I knew. I had been so blinded by the idea that they were family, that they were looking out for me, that I hadn't seen how toxic they had become. And yet, even knowing all of that, even after walking away from their manipulation, I still felt a painful guilt gnawing at me. Was I really the one who had betrayed them, or had they betrayed me by dragging me into their web of lies? I wasn't prepared for how cold things would become between us. Sarah, in particular, made it her mission to make sure I knew that she would never forgive me. At first, I tried to stay away, keeping my distance from family events where I knew she'd be. But there was no avoiding the tension forever. It came to a head during another family dinner, this time hosted at my parents' house. I walked in, trying to act normal, trying to ignore the weight of Sarah's eyes burning into me from across the room. Claire was there too, sitting quietly in the corner, looking like a shell of the vibrant woman she had once been. It was clear that the affair had taken its toll on her, and she hadn't been the same since Tim left. She had tried reaching out to me a few times, but every message felt hollow, as though she couldn't bring herself to actually apologize or acknowledge the damage she had caused. As we sat around the dinner table, the tension was palpable. No one spoke openly about what had happened, but it was there, hanging over us like a dark cloud. Sarah kept glaring at me, her jaw tight with anger. I knew it was only a matter of time before she exploded. Sure enough, halfway through dinner, she put down her fork and looked directly at me. So she began, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Are you happy now? You got what you wanted, didn't you?" The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at her, and then at me. "Sarah, not now," my mom said, trying to keep the peace. But Sarah wasn't having it. "No, let her speak," she snapped, her eyes still locked on me. "She's been so righteous, so perfect through all of this. I think it's time she tells us how it feels to tear this family apart." I felt the heat rising in my chest, a mix of anger and shame. "I didn't tear anything apart," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "You did that yourselves." Sarah scoffed, leaning back in her chair. You always did like to play the victim, didn't you? Poor little you, caught up in the big bad adult's mistakes. You think you're so innocent, don't you? I'm not the one who cheated, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop myself. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire winced, as if the words had physically hurt her. My parents sat there, unsure of what to say, while the rest of the family just watched, not wanting to get involved. You're such a hypocrite, Sarah hissed. You think you're better than us? You think you're some kind of hero for blowing up our lives? You're just a coward. You couldn't handle it, so you ran to mommy and daddy and tattled like a child. My hands were shaking, but I didn't back down. I didn't run to anyone. You put me in an impossible position, and I had to make a choice. I'm not going to keep covering for your mistakes. I won't be part of your lies anymore. Sarah's face twisted with rage, but before she could say anything else, Aunt Claire finally spoke up. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper. Stop it, Sarah, this isn't her fault. Sarah turned to her sister, incredulous. Are you seriously defending her? After everything? Claire sighed, running a hand through her hair. I'm not defending anyone, but this isn't about her. We did this. We made these choices, and we have to live with the consequences. For the first time, I saw real regret in Claire's eyes. It wasn't enough to erase the hurt, but it was something. Sarah, on the other hand, wasn't ready to accept any responsibility. She stood up abruptly, throwing her napkin onto the table. You're all pathetic, she spat, before storming out of the room. The rest of the dinner passed in an awkward, strained silence. I excused myself as soon as I could, needing to get out of there before the weight of everything crushed me. As I drove home, I couldn't stop replaying Sarah's words in my head. She had always been manipulative, but I hadn't expected her to lash out at me like that. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. After that night, I made the decision to cut ties with Sarah completely. There was no point in trying to salvage a relationship that had been so thoroughly poisoned. Claire, on the other hand, seemed genuinely remorseful, and part of me wanted to give her a second chance. But I knew that things would never be the same between us. The trust had been shattered, and no matter how much I wanted to fix it, I couldn't. I went back to Reddit a few days later and updated my post, letting everyone know what had happened. The responses were supportive, with people telling me that I had done the right thing by standing up for myself and refusing to be part of the lies any longer. It was comforting to know that there were people out there who understood what I was going through, even if they were just strangers on the internet. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild my life. I focused on work, on my friends, on trying to find some semblance of normalcy after the chaos of the past few months. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my aunt's mistakes. There were still moments when the guilt would creep in, moments when I wondered if I could have handled things differently. But then I'd remind myself that I had done the best I could with the cards I had been dealt. I hadn't asked to be dragged into their mess, and I certainly hadn't asked to be forced to choose between family and my own moral compass. As time passed, the family slowly began to heal. It wasn't perfect, and there were still lingering tensions, but we found a way to move forward. Uncle Tim eventually moved on, starting a new life for himself far away from the mess that had destroyed his marriage. Claire tried to pick up the pieces, but I could tell that she would never fully recover from what had happened. As for Sarah, she remained distant, cutting ties with most of the family and refusing to speak to me ever again. And me, I finally learned that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about the people who support you, who love you, and who don't force you into compromising your values. I had to learn that the hard way, but in the end I came out stronger for it. Betrayal cuts deep, but it doesn't define you. It's how you respond to it, how you choose to move forward, that truly matters. And for the first time in my life, I felt free from the lies, free from the guilt, and free to live my life on my own terms. In the months that followed, I found myself both free and lost in equal measure. The chains of my aunt's manipulation had been broken, but I was left standing in the ruins of relationships that had once defined me. The family dynamic, once filled with laughter and love, now felt fractured, as though every interaction was laced with unspoken tension. One thing I hadn't expected was how much I would miss them, even after everything. Claire's absence in my life, in particular, weighed heavily on me. She had always been the one who offered advice, the one who was there for me when I needed a comforting shoulder. Despite the betrayal, despite the lies, I missed her, or at least, I missed the version of her I thought I knew. I couldn't shake the feeling that deep down she was remorseful, that she was still struggling with the fallout from her choices. As for Sarah, I knew there was no turning back. The anger she had unleashed at that family dinner had shown me who she truly was: manipulative, cold, and unwilling to accept any responsibility for the destruction she had caused. Cutting ties with her wasn't just necessary, it was a form of self-preservation. Even though she was family, I knew she had become toxic, and I had no interest in inviting that poison back into my life. But life moved on, as it always does. I found solace in my friends, in my work, and even in the anonymous community on Reddit that had been there for me when I felt like I had no one else. Slowly, I began to heal. I didn't feel whole yet, but I felt lighter, as though I had finally begun to unburden myself from the weight of the betrayal that had consumed me for so long. It was during this time that I made a conscious decision to focus on myself, to rebuild my life with boundaries I could be proud of. I started going to therapy, something I had resisted for a long time, but now, more than ever, I needed help processing everything. My therapist, a calm, understanding woman named Elaine, became a crucial part of my healing journey. It's important to remember that you can love someone and still set boundaries, Elaine had told me in one of our sessions. Family can hurt us in ways that are often deeper than we expect because we're conditioned to believe that they should always have our best interests at heart. But love without boundaries can lead to manipulation, and that's what happened to you. Her words struck a chord with me. I had spent so much of my life believing that, because Claire and Sarah were family, I owed them my loyalty, no matter what. But loyalty, I was learning, didn't mean blind obedience. It didn't mean sacrificing my morals to cover for their mistakes. Family was important, but my own sense of self-worth and integrity were more important. Despite the progress I was making in therapy, the situation with my family remained complicated. My parents were supportive, but they too were hurt by everything that had happened. My mom in particular was struggling with the fractured relationship between her sisters. She had always been the glue that held the family together, and now she felt as though that glue had dissolved. One evening, a few months after everything had come to light, my mom asked me to come over for dinner. I knew she had something on her mind. She had been quiet lately, distant in a way that wasn't like her. When I arrived, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in front of her, staring off into space. "Hey, Mom," I said, sitting down across from her. "Everything okay?" She looked up at me, her eyes tired and sad. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she said softly, "about Claire, about Sarah, about what happened with the family." I nodded, not sure where this conversation was headed. "I feel like I failed," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have seen what was happening with them. I should have stepped in sooner. Maybe if I had." "Mom, this isn't your fault," I interrupted, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You couldn't have known what they were doing. And even if you had, you couldn't have stopped them. They made their own choices." She sighed, squeezing my hand. "I know, but I can't help feeling responsible. We were always so close, the three of us. I just can't believe it's all fallen apart like this." The pain in her voice was palpable, and it broke my heart to see her hurting like this. My mom had always been the one who tried to keep the peace, who believed in family above all else. But now, with everything shattered, I could see that she was struggling to find her place in this new, broken version of our family. "What are you going to do?" I asked gently, not sure if she had an answer. She shook her head. "I don't know. Claire's been reaching out to me, trying to make amends. But Sarah's gone. She won't talk to me, to anyone. She's cut herself off completely." "I don't think Sarah wants to make amends," I said carefully. "She doesn't see what she did as wrong." "I know," my mom replied, her voice heavy with sadness, "but she's still my sister." We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. It was hard to accept that the family I had known my whole life was no longer the same, that the people I had grown up loving and trusting were now strangers to me. But I also knew that I couldn't hold on to the past forever. I had to let go of the version of my aunts that I had once believed in and accept the reality of who they had become. After that night, things between my mom and Claire slowly began to thaw. My mom, ever the peacemaker, couldn't completely shut her sister out, and Claire, for her part, seemed genuinely remorseful for what had happened. They started talking again, tentatively at first, but gradually they began to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't the same as it had been before, and I doubted it ever would be, but it was a start. As for me, I kept my distance. Claire had reached out a few times, but I wasn't ready to let her back into my life. I wasn't sure if I ever would be. I had forgiven her in my heart because holding on to that anger was exhausting, but forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean I had to let her hurt me again. Sarah, on the other hand, remained a ghost. She had cut off all contact with the family, disappearing into her own world of bitterness and denial. There were whispers that she had moved away, that she was trying to start over somewhere new, but no one knew for sure. Part of me wondered if she would ever come back, if she would ever try to make things right. But deep down, I knew she wouldn't. Sarah was too proud, too stubborn to admit that she had been wrong. The holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, they all felt different without the whole family together. We tried to make the best of it, but there was always an empty seat at the table, a reminder of the people who were missing. It was a strange kind of grief, mourning the loss of relationships that were still technically alive but irreparably broken. But as time passed, I began to find peace in the new normal. I focused on the people who had been there for me, who had supported me through the hardest time of my life. I reconnected with old friends, strengthened my relationship with my parents, and found new ways to fill the void that my aunts had left behind. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all still felt unbearable. But I had learned something important through all of this. I had the strength to set boundaries, to stand up for myself, and to walk away from toxic relationships. Even when they were family, I had learned that betrayal, while painful, didn't define me. It had shaped me, yes, but it had also shown me who I really was and what I was capable of. And in the end, that was enough.